My name is Ethan Collins. I'm 32 years old, and I live in an old house in a quiet neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. About 2 years ago, I decided to buy this house, despite its low price. It was big, with several rooms, and it was located in a peaceful area, which really appealed to me. The house needed some renovations, of course, but it was perfect for someone like me, living alone. Over the years, I've been making the necessary adjustments, fixing what needed work, and getting used to the creaks of the house, something common in old buildings. At first, none of this bothered me. Everything started a few weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday, when the night had already fallen and the house seemed quieter than ever. As usual, I sat down in the living room, turned on the TV, and had a quick snack. I was exhausted after a long workday, and the last thing I wanted was to think about anything other than resting. But it was on that night that everything changed. I was there, trying to focus on some random show, when I heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was a soft noise, almost imperceptible, like the creaking of wood. At first, I thought it was just the old floorboards of the house, maybe a door that hadn't been fully closed, something like that. But the sound started to get clearer. It sounded like someone was walking upstairs, with heavy steps but slow, almost trying not to make noise. I looked up at the ceiling, feeling a twinge of unease. I was alone in the house. I was sure of it. There was no one else here. I stood up from the chair, hesitating, and climbed the stairs, heading toward the largest bedroom. There was nothing strange. The silence returned. I went back downstairs, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe the exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But then the sound came back. It wasn't loud, but unmistakable. Footsteps from upstairs, clearer this time. My heart raced, and I nearly dropped my phone. The house was empty. There couldn't be anyone up there. But the sound continued, now moving down the hall, as if someone was pacing back and forth. The fear began to take hold of me, but at the same time, a sense of curiosity, or maybe desperation, made me go upstairs again. I wanted to understand what was happening. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped for a moment and looked around. The hallway was empty. The bedroom door was closed. There was no one there, no signs of anything unusual. I took a deep breath and went back to the living room, convincing myself that it was all just a trick of my mind, until something even stranger happened. Suddenly I heard a voice, muffled and distant, like someone was whispering from upstairs. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that it wasn't my imagination. The voice seemed human. I froze. Panic took over me, and a feeling that something was terribly wrong made me want to run out of the house. But I couldn't. Instead, I went up again, faster, determined to figure out what was going on. I opened every door, checked the attic, the closets, even the windows, but I found nothing. The sound stopped abruptly, but the fear lingered. It was like the space of the house was closing in around me, trapping me. It was as if I were the only one not noticing something happening, like the house itself was alive, just watching me. I spent hours that night, going up and down, hearing the footsteps and voices that always seemed to avoid me. The sound would move to the place where I wasn't. At one moment, it seemed to come from one direction, and then shift to another. I was starting to believe I was losing my mind, until at midnight, the silence returned to the house. No more footsteps, no more voices, just emptiness. I couldn't understand it. I sat on the couch, not knowing what to do. Nothing seemed real, but I knew I hadn't made it all up. In the following days, the sounds returned. Not as intensely, but they were still there, like a constant presence. It was as if something was watching me. No matter what I did, the footsteps always started moving, and the voice, though inaudible, still seemed to echo in my mind. I went up to the attic, looking for some sign of an animal, maybe a raccoon or a rat, but nothing. Everything was spotless. There was no logical explanation. I decided to look into the history of the house. I went to a local library and found some interesting things. The house had been built in the late 19th century, and apparently several families had lived there before me. What caught my attention, however, was a mention of a fire that had occurred in the 1920s, in the upper part of the house where the bedrooms were. I couldn't find many details, but it seemed that the house had been the site of some tragic event. This made me think more about the nature of the sounds I was hearing. That same night, something even more bizarre happened. I was trying to sleep, already exhausted from all the investigating and living in fear, when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they were different. They weren't just footsteps. It was a stronger presence, more invasive, as if someone was right behind me, watching me. I turned quickly, not knowing what to expect. But when I looked behind me, there was nothing, just emptiness. My heart was pounding. I was scared. And at that moment, I knew the sound wasn't coming from anywhere physical. It was in my mind, in my head. Something was there with me, but it wasn't something I could see. And that terrified me even more. In the following weeks, the footsteps returned, but at irregular intervals. Sometimes at night, sometimes during the day. It was as if something was watching me, always avoiding me, moving to places where I wasn't. I no longer knew if it was my mind or if there was truly something there. But one thing was certain. The feeling of being watched never left. One day, when I thought the worst had passed, something strange happened. I was sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when a shadow passed quickly by the door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I looked again, I saw a skeletal figure, faint, just a silhouette, disappearing between the rooms. I immediately stood up and went to check, but I found nothing. And once again, the sound of footsteps started, farther away, but increasingly unbearable. Today, although the sounds have diminished, I still feel the presence. I know I am not alone. The house has never been the same since that day. I don't know what happened or what is happening, but no matter how much I try to forget, the footsteps continue. They come and go, but always, always when I least expect it. This translation contains 1,941 words as well. Let me know if you'd like any changes or adjustments. My name is Emily. I'm 29 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me when I was 13. Even today, thinking about it makes my heart race, and I avoid talking about it, but maybe opening up here will help me deal with what happened. It all started on a regular afternoon, on a day that should have been like any other. I was home alone, something that wasn't unusual because my parents worked late. My older brother had moved to college that year, so I was the only child still living in the house. Our home was a typical suburban 2-story house, with bedrooms upstairs and a living room and kitchen downstairs. I was in my room, sitting on the floor, finishing my homework, when I heard a child's voice coming from my brother's room. It was low and muffled, but clear enough for me to understand. "Hey, can you hear me?" At that moment, I froze. There was no one home, and my brother's room had been empty since he moved out. I thought I had heard wrong, or maybe it was a sound coming from outside. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on what I was doing, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Please, don't be scared. I need your help." I froze again, this time feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up, went to my brother's room and opened the door, expecting to find, I don't know, maybe a radio playing or something like that. But the room was empty, just like he had left it months ago, with boxes stacked in the corner and the bed neatly made. I looked around, and everything was completely normal. Then I heard the voice again, closer this time, almost as if it were right next to me. "I'm stuck here." I got chills all over my body and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but my heart was pounding. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, trying to hear anything else. The house was completely silent. I felt stupid for being so scared, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore what had just happened. After a while, the voice returned, more insistent. "Why are you ignoring me? I just want to talk." This time, it sounded like it was coming from inside my room, just a few feet away. I almost screamed, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I asked hesitantly, "Who are you?" The response came quickly, and it was the thing that scared me the most. "I'm your friend." The voice was childish, but there was something in it that made me uneasy. I asked how it got into the house, and the response froze me. "I've always been here. You've never noticed me before?" That didn't make sense. How could someone be in my house all the time without me knowing? But what really terrified me was the tone of familiarity in the voice, like this thing knew more about me than it should. As the conversation went on, the voice started saying things about me, things no one else knew. It mentioned my diary hidden at the back of the closet, the name of the boy I had a crush on, and even a secret I had never told anyone, that I was terrified of the dark. I started sweating cold. I asked who had told it these things, but it just laughed, as if my question was silly. "I know because I'm always with you," it said. At this point, I was trembling. I tried to ignore it and pretend nothing was happening. I grabbed my phone to call my mom, but the moment I opened the app, the voice said, "It's no use calling her. She won't believe you." That made me drop my phone. How did it know what I was doing? I started pacing my room, trying to think of something rational, but nothing made sense. Then, the thing started asking for help. It said it was trapped in the house, couldn't leave, and needed me. I asked how it got stuck there, but it would just dodge the question, saying it was complicated to explain. The more it talked, the more I had the feeling that it wasn't what it claimed to be. I asked again who or what it was, and it stayed silent for a moment before replying, "Someone who needs you." By this point, I was shaking. I tried to leave the room, but the door, which didn't have a lock, simply wouldn't open. I pulled the doorknob with all my strength, but it seemed stuck. On the other side of the door, the voice said calmly, "You can't leave yet." I started screaming, begging it to leave me alone, but it kept talking, now quieter, as if whispering directly in my ear. It said things that only made my fear grow, like it was enjoying the situation. After what felt like hours, the voice stopped. The doorknob finally gave way, and I ran out of the room. I grabbed my backpack, my phone, and ran out of the house. I sat on the sidewalk until my mom got home from work. She was worried when she saw me so scared, but when I told her what happened, she laughed, saying I had a very vivid imagination. That night, I slept in the living room with all the lights on. Nothing else happened that day, but for weeks I avoided being home alone. I never told anyone else about this story, but sometimes I feel like there's still something in the house. I don't hear the voice anymore, but every once in a while I feel like I'm being watched. To this day, I don't know what that was, but just remembering it still gives me the chills. My name is Michael, I'm 28 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. It's been a while, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I think I'm going to share it here. I don't know why, but after all this time, maybe it's the only way to try to understand what happened. I know it might sound crazy, but I swear it was real. It happened about 2 years ago, but what I lived through that day still makes me wake up in the middle of the night, trembling and covered in cold sweat. It was a regular winter night here in Seattle. The cold was already cutting through the air, and I was home alone after a long day at work. I took a hot shower, just trying to relax a bit. Those hours you give yourself to forget about the day's stress. Just like any other shower, with steam spreading across the mirror and creating that foggy effect that makes everything look a bit blurry. I didn't think anything of it until things started happening. The steam began to form something. At first, it was just a blur, nothing I really noticed. But soon I saw one word. Careful. That was the first one. I thought I was seeing things. The steam was forming, just like it always does, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the word careful disappeared, and a second message appeared. You're not suffering alone. What was I seeing? I stepped back from the mirror, feeling a chill run up my spine, and I even took a step backward as if that would solve anything. But it didn't. The steam continued to form, and new words began to appear. I stood still there, not knowing what to do. It was like someone was writing directly on the mirror, and the strangest part was that somehow I knew it was meant for me. I felt invaded, as if that moment of peace had been broken by something I couldn't understand. I stepped closer again, trying to figure out what was happening. More words, one after another. I'm watching you, appeared shortly after the first phrase. I just kept staring at the steam forming on the mirror, and my heart started pounding faster. I knew this didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. My mind began to race in many directions. I looked around, feeling completely lost. There was no logical explanation for what was going on. The words kept appearing one after another, and I was frozen, unable to react. Get out of there was next. I didn't know what to do. What was happening? This wasn't a reflection of my own thoughts. That much was clear. It wasn't a trick of my mind. Something was really happening. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. It was like someone was right behind me, watching me with a cold, merciless stare. But when I turned around quickly, the bathroom was empty, and everything was exactly the same as before. The shower water was still falling. But then the next message appeared, and I couldn't take it anymore. You can't escape. At that moment, the tension inside me exploded, and I ran out of the bathroom, as if the very air was suffocating me. The steam on the mirror didn't disappear, and the words seemed to keep forming, like the mirror had a life of its own. I tried to rationalize it. What could it be? A defect in the mirror? A mistake in my brain? Was I going crazy? I couldn't find a convincing explanation. I ran to the living room, grabbed my phone, and nervously started searching for something that could explain what was happening. I didn't find anything. No reference to anything like this. It was like this experience was unique and maybe even planned, as if someone was forcing me to see it. I tried to calm myself down, but the fear was palpable. How could someone write messages on a mirror with steam? How could something so specific, so focused on me, happen with no explanation? My heart was still racing, and the panic that started to take over me was worse than anything I'd ever experienced. It was a feeling like I was being hunted, like something was getting closer to me, something I couldn't see, but it was there, near me. I went back to the bathroom after a while. The mirror was still fogged up, but nothing else was written. Nothing. That emptiness bothered me more than anything. For a moment, I thought everything had just been an illusion, that my mind was overloaded. I took a deep breath, even gave a nervous smile to myself, trying to laugh at the situation. But when I stepped away from the mirror, I saw the last message, "I'll be waiting." That made me freeze. That phrase was like a knife to my mind. I ran out of the house, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go. I stayed up all night, thinking about what happened. In the middle of the night, I decided to search the internet for something that could explain what I had seen. But every search turned up nothing. I couldn't find anything about messages in the mirror or similar phenomena. It wasn't a pattern. It wasn't something easy to explain. The next day, when I went to work, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. And the strangest thing of all was that no matter how much I tried to deny it, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. For days I felt stalked, like the mirror, that reflection, was staring at me all the time, even when I wasn't near it. I couldn't look at a mirror without thinking about that moment. Even today, I avoid looking at mirrors for too long. But the weirdest part is that, after that night, the messages never appeared again. They stopped forming. It was like it never happened. But at the same time, I knew I wasn't crazy. I had lived through that. It couldn't have just been a delusion of my mind. Something had tried to communicate with me, and I still don't know what it was. That feeling of being watched has never left me. It's like something stayed there waiting, just like the last message said. My name is Kevin. I'm 34 years old, and I live in San Francisco, California. What I'm about to tell you happened almost 2 years ago, but to this day, every time night falls, I get a chill down my spine. I never really figured out what exactly happened, but I'll try to describe it as clearly as possible, because if anyone else has experienced something similar, at least they'll know they're not alone. I lived alone in a relatively small but cozy apartment. It used to be my safe space until something started to change. The first nights didn't seem strange at all. I would just wake up in the middle of the night, look at the clock, and go back to sleep. But then one night, around 3 a.m., I woke up again, like I always did. There was nothing particularly special about it, except for the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it and shut my eyes, but the feeling only got stronger. That night, I simply couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, and I started thinking about everything that could be happening. Then, something made me look at the corner of my room. When I looked, I almost fell out of bed from shock. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. In the middle of the darkness, I could swear something was there, just staring at me. My heart started pounding, but I, trying to stay calm, went to the switch and turned on the light. Nothing. Everything seemed normal. In the following days, I began noticing something strange. I would wake up at the same time every night, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I tried sleeping with the light on, but it didn't help. I started feeling more and more exhausted because I knew whatever was happening at that moment would keep happening. By the end of the week, I decided to install a camera in my room, hidden near the shelf. I wanted to prove it was just my mind playing tricks, but what the camera captured left me speechless. The next night, I was at home as usual. I woke up at the same time, and the feeling was there, just as strong as the previous nights. I went to the camera, which was recording, and reviewed the footage. I froze. There in the footage, I could see a figure. It wasn't a ghost, nor something visible like a shadow, but a person. A figure standing next to my bed. They were leaning over me, as if watching me deeply, with a calmness that was terrifying. There was no expression, just a presence. And the strangest thing of all was that when the room light turned on in the footage, the figure disappeared instantly. It was as if it was swallowed by the darkness. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping it was some trick. But it wasn't. I was alone in the recording, and in my mind I knew that at that moment, something I couldn't explain was happening. The nights became longer, and I couldn't tell the difference between real fear and the feeling of paranoia. I even tried leaving the light on during the night, but that didn't stop the fact that every time I woke up, the feeling of something being there, watching, came back with even more intensity. I tried to find explanations, like lights or reflections, that might cause the illusion of someone being there, but nothing seemed to make sense. The figure felt so real, so tangible, but at the same time it wasn't. I even thought about moving to a different place, but something inside me stopped me. It was as if this presence had become a part of me, a weight I carried with me every night. After a few weeks, I started thinking that maybe it was better to just ignore it. After all, when you live in fear, what else can you do? But one of those nights, I woke up once again and went to the camera to see the footage. What I saw was even more disturbing. The figure wasn't just watching anymore. It was closer to me. In a way that I can't even describe, it was by my side, almost touching my bed. I could see that it was moving, but in such a silent, quick way that it seemed more like a blur of movement than an actual person. I didn't know what to do. It was like I was trapped in an endless nightmare, where every night repeated itself, but in a more agonizing way. I even started looking for answers on the internet, on forums, videos, anything that could help me understand what was going on. It wasn't until I found a post from someone saying they had experienced something very similar. The person talked about the night visitor, a figure that comes close to you during the night and disappears when the light is turned on. There were no clear explanations, but the description was exactly what I was living through. Time passed, and eventually the presence disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. There was no warning, no explanation. One night, I woke up as usual, but there was nothing. There was no feeling of being watched, and when I turned on the light, everything seemed normal. The camera didn't capture anything anymore, and since then I never saw that figure again. But to this day, I can't explain what happened. I don't have the camera anymore, and I try not to think about it. But every time night comes, I get a strange feeling, like I'm being watched again. I don't know if it was real, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. All I know is that I've never been able to look at darkness the same way again.